Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. These first 2 weeks of the month have been almost a wash as far as reading goes, despite the fact that I have a zillion books on my nonfiction TBR that I'm really extremely excited about. I've read a few chapters from a few books, but not enough that I have anything thoughtful to say about them. So I thought I would do a book tag, but instead of a tag about reading, a tag about writing. I've mentioned before that in the past I published a couple of academic history books, and I'm incredibly honored that a handful of booktubers are buddy reading one of them right now. Wild. Nevertheless, I'm pretty sure my career as an historian is behind me. Although I have put out a handful of book reviews fairly recently, I've not published anything longer or more formal than that in quite a while. Nevertheless, I pretty much write every day. And I've thought quite a bit about various possibilities for new writing projects and book ideas. Two proposals are ones that I spent quite some time with, playing through the ideas fairly seriously, but eventually discarding the plans because of the flaws in my thinking or in the proposed research process, flaws I just couldn't work past. Another idea is for a book that I know I'm not the author to write. And another possibility is a joint project that I hope will actually take flight at some point, perhaps sometime soon. And there are always other subjects that flit in and out of my brain, but really have not developed in any significant way yet. In short, I have a tendency to narrate my whole life as I live it, trying to figure out where the plot is going and what the major themes are, and even what words and syntax would help me shape it better. I suspect that non-readers do this kind of shaping of their lives in a different way, that is, without thinking of it in literary terms and without writing it down for posterity, rather just making their actual life matter. Okay, on to the tag questions. Number 1. What is your favorite genre to write? As I suggested before, my main genres are all nonfiction, especially social history, biography aimed at exploring wider society rather than specific individuals, and perhaps memoir connected to larger cultural questions than merely personal experiences. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that last one. I spent quite a bit of time outlining and starting to draft a book intended to be sort of a memoir of non-spirituality, of living without faith, but nevertheless being fascinated by religion and belief. I wanted to weave together my own varied experience over my life and the history of ideas about doubt and atheism across the centuries. As it turns out, at least at that moment, and at this moment, I'm just not prepared to write that book. Not because of a lack of research, but because of a lack of clarity about what the book's main argument and narrative arc should be exactly. A time may come when I have a breakthrough and will return to my old notes, but I'm not expecting it anytime soon, honestly. Question 2. Do you prefer to write short stories or novels? Since I'm a writer of nonfiction, I suppose the parallel would be essays or full books. I definitely am long-winded enough, and I am a slow and plodding thinker who has a tendency to somewhat long-term obsessions that I tend to prefer to think about full-length studies. Actually, right now, I'm considering how to put together an essay, and if it goes according to plan, which will require much more regular reading than I'm doing right now, I will definitely let you know and probably want to chat about some of the big ideas I'll be playing with all of you. More eventually, I hope. I have been a little obsessed with one idea for a novel lately. I'm calling it The Walden Year, and it's about a college student who is planning to write his senior thesis on Thoreau and is sent home from college because of the pandemic. His elderly grandfather, a former contractor, has recently moved into his own son's home and is struggling with his changing role. The young man and the old man bond as they build a tiny house out in the socially distanced woods. I, quote, came up with this project because I misheard or misunderstood a situation someone was telling me. It wasn't my imagination telling me. And sadly, alongside having no real imagination for fiction, I have too little knowledge of Thoreau, although I know I could remedy that, and absolutely no experience in carpentry. But the lack of ability to make things up is definitely the bigger problem. Interestingly, in my second book, Unspeakable, The Story of Junius Wilson, my co-writer and I were writing about a man about whom there were quite limited and complicated sources. We knew very little how Wilson himself might have understood his own life. Susan and I talked a lot about how we wish we could just make stuff up sometime. Just take the characters and the frame and animate them as we saw fit. But on the other hand, there was incredible pleasure in being held to what we knew. I think about poets writing to a strict form, maybe a sonnet or whatever, and feeling that the restraints actually could help free them in some way. That's true when authors are writing serious nonfiction too. Wilson and the people in his life were asking us from the past to consider how they imagined the world. And sometimes that fact allowed us to imagine or even partially understand the breadth of humanity in ways quite beyond what we could have come up with if we were writing fiction. I have a lot to say about the process of writing that book, and I'm going to save it for another time since it doesn't fit perfectly in this tag. Question 3. Who inspired you to write? I'm going to name 3 people here, and the first 2 are fictional. That seems appropriate, doesn't it? The first is Jo March, one of Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. Jo is the writer in the family, the sister initially least interested in domesticity and love, and most interested in creating a writing life. I think I first read Little Women when I was in the 3rd grade, and I read the book almost every year until I went to college, and several times since then. Although I see parts of Meg and Beth and even Amy in me at times, I, like an enormous number of readers, recognize myself in Jo. And we're all pretty sure that Louisa May Alcott saw herself in Jo as well, imagining her character squirreled away in her room, writing a story about her family. At just about the same time I was reading Little Women, I was entranced with the television character John Boy Walton, also writing away in his room after his large and non-writerly family went to bed. I can't remember why, but I know I talked about John Boy recently on this channel, and I vaguely remember a discussion in the comments about the links between Jo and John Boy. Of course, the third person who inspired me to write was my father. He was an author himself, and from him I got to see the writing process happening on a daily basis. The typing every evening as I went to bed, the drafts sent off in thick manila envelopes mailed to his editor, and then returned with commentary, and even sorting thousands of index cards in various piles on our teal-colored shag rug in the living room as we all participated in putting his index together. I am so grateful that computers were around before I started my own writing career. The 4th question. Do you have a writing muse? No, I don't at all. I was really fascinated when Steve Donahue talked about how he used to write with specific people in his head, his own audience that he was talking to as he typed. And I remember how my father talked about making his book something that I could understand. It was an academic book, but he, not in his initial writing, but in his editing, wanted it to be accessible to the young high schooler I was at the time. While I don't have that kind of muse, the question does make me remember a really important lesson I learned at some point and then taught way back when I was a writing tutor in grad school. When students are writing papers assigned for the classes they take, it's really common for them to write specifically for their professors. Sometimes they think their professors want them to replicate what the professors have already said, showing they learned it properly. At least in the humanities, professors rarely want that kind of work. In fact, I remember back when I was in school that the word on the street was that if you turned in a well-written essay that agreed with the professor, you'd get a B. If you wanted an A, you had to disagree to make the professor think, perhaps make the professor consider whole new ideas, and even change his or her mind. Anyway, perhaps because they know they're being graded by someone, student writers often imagine their audiences as their teachers. Learning to write for a larger audience is really the trick to becoming a better writer, I think. For me, in a writing workshop I took in early college, I had to share my writing with all the students in my seminar, and that was the start of learning that lesson. I say all this because I think the idea of a muse can sometimes even hold writers back if they aren't kind of sophisticated about that audience already. Does that make any sense? Okay, question number 5. Do you NaNoWriMo, or are you going to? I have never written a novel or anything else for National Novel Writing Month, but I have often considered doing it, possibly since what I think might have been its very first year. Way back then, I bit off a slightly different project. NaNoSwemo, or National Knit a Sweater in a Month. For my first NaNoSwemo, I knit something for my son, still young at the time, with a castle stitched into the front, made up of cables and other patterned stitches, all in one color, and using just texture to show the castle. The next year for NaNoSwemo, I made a cardigan with multicolored entrelac sleeves and a torso section made of diagonal sections, with something like 10 balls of yarn that were all active at once. Both sweaters were actually fairly fast to knit and far simpler than they looked, but both were kind of showy performances, at least for me. Anyway, I've never done NaNoWriMo. Mostly because in general, I'm a very slow writer who gets totally freaked out by the pressure of deadlines. I did consider doing and even planned for the Nano Camp this past year, but events transpired that made it seem like the wrong time. Since I've been on BookTube, I've gotten quite a bit more interested in giving NaNoWriMo a shot at some point in the future. We'll see. Maybe y'all can encourage me early next fall. Question 6. Do you like live write-ins? I've never seen one, but I don't think it would work for me. I really depend on quiet and solitude when I'm writing. Academic libraries are fine, but I work best at home in my own room with the door closed, and even back when it was possible when there was no one else in the house. And then, once I get in the groove, I'm pretty much totally unaware of everything going on around me. I think the psychologist Csikszentmihalyi called this kind of experience flow, and I love and crave that experience of being utterly submerged in whatever I'm doing. If I were watching a live write-in, I would either never fall into that flow groove, or I would totally miss the live write-in. But maybe I'll try it sometime, perhaps even when I'm knitting or making a to-do list or whatever, rather than actually writing. The next tag question. Do you write your first draft on paper or computer? Computer, absolutely. Although I often scribble down very preliminary ideas on paper, especially when I'm away from my laptop, I not only write, but think by typing. I am awful when I try to talk off the cuff. As I'm sure you realize, I plan out everything beforehand in these BookTube videos. And when I try to do anything else, to wing it, even for one little addition, I crash and burn. But while I would love to be a better writer, when I'm writing, I often feel that my brain is working better than I knew it could work. Something happens between my head and my fingers and the page that feels far more real and authentic than when I am trying to talk aloud. especially to strangers or to the camera, and even with my closest friends. I guess there must be people who think by writing who can have that with pen and paper, but I can't. I have to spend too much time trying to make my handwriting legible so that I will at least be able to figure out what I wrote the day before. So I even write my personal writing, my journals, on computer. I don't have a tablet, and I don't get the same connection when I'm thumb typing on my small little phone. But a full-size QWERTY keyboard is part of my DNA. And the final question, are you a pantster, a plotter, or a plantster? These are not words I knew until this year when I started learning more about the specifics of NaNoWriMo. They aren't terms I've ever heard in the writing community aside from these National Novel Writing Month groups. If somehow you've missed it, plotters are people who plan things out fairly rigorously beforehand. Pantsters are people who do it by the seat of their pants. And plantsters do some combination, having a direction in mind, but keeping things fresh and green. As for myself, although I have not done NaNoWriMo, as I said, I am fundamentally a plotter. Because almost everything I think about writing is nonfiction, either history or biography or memoir of some sort, it is quite a bit harder to be a pantster, I think. Is that true? While one can write memoirs and biographies that are not strictly chronological, nonfiction has a kind of built-in direction to it that fiction doesn't necessarily have. There's a place to aim for, at the very least. The kind of writing I've published in the past has relied on research, on interviews or family letters or whatever, and that research really has to be at least mostly done before sketching out any kind of serious thesis-driven argument. Honestly, though, I think if I were to decide to try to write a novel, I would be a plotter for that as well. I would need to have a basic outline and a clear narrative arc. While I say all that, I do often see directions to go in and connections to make as I am writing, things I have not, in fact, planned out at all. Sometimes the connections seem to be there already, without me having consciously planned them, but when I see them, I realize I need to write in a way that makes them more explicit or more developed. Sometimes I get whole new ideas and find myself even having to do new supporting research to buff up an unplanned for section. But these are just the slight exceptions that prove the rule. I am a plotter, and a plotting plotter at that. So that's it. I'm not going to tag anyone since I know this has been going around a bit already, but I would especially love to hear from some of you who mostly write nonfiction, or who are thinking about trying your hand at some nonfiction. Maybe you're an academic, maybe you have a memoir in you. Please let me know if you make a version of this tag. Well, thanks for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. Slightly different meaning of Hannah's Books, isn't it? See you soon.